All right, so some key points for us to think about when we consider the migration north to create what would be the concentration of Blacks in Harlem to birth the creativity, the artistry, the expression all in one place. We know, as I said, that there were lynchings that caused Blacks to really recognize, as they had already as former slaves, that they needed to seek a better life. And then also there was the industrial expansion that was taking place in the North that meant that Blacks could be hired for labor and wage earning positions. And that intensified as we entered the First World War. So that means once we know that there are jobs and then there's the opportunity to go into the armed forces, you see Blacks leaving the South. And then once they get to Harlem, here is a place where it became available to Blacks when it became essentially overbuilt or overrun. There was more buildings than those that desired to live in them. And it was originally for middle class and upper middle class whites, but when that did not manifest, we see Blacks moving into these spaces and being able to find a quality of residence that they might not have found in other places, and it was afforded to Blacks. And so this is where we see a congregation of wealthy African Americans, writers and artists. And that's why I think as a default, we also see the popularity of the music growing, because this, again, is a place where prominent individuals can come. They can live relatively well in comparison to what might be available to Blacks in other parts of the country. And it essentially becomes what James Weldon Johnson calls the Negro capital of the world. And there are many major national organizations that were in or based out of Harlem during that time, or in New York. That would be the NAACP, the National Urban League, and Marcus Garvey's organization. During this time, we also see the emergence of great literary publications and periodicals. And so Crisis, Negro World Opportunity, The Messenger are just some of the different periodicals that were also popular during that time and disseminated for Black Americans to be able to read and to share their thoughts and ideas. And so, as we know, because intellectualism is continuing to grow among Black Americans, and we see educated Black Americans emerging to a greater degree on the social scene within the Black community, we see the development of profound literary authors and thinkers and writers. And so there is a time, this is a time in which Black writers can kind of challenge themselves to think about their experiences and the context in which they live, not just as people in the United States, again, but people who have been taken from their homeland. And then there's a challenge to diversify the way in which Blacks are represented in literature. So we know from the slavery and freedom period that slave narratives were kind of popular sources of information on Black life and Black experiences. However, when we see the Harlem Renaissance literature developing, we see a depth of characters, a depth of experiences that we might not have otherwise seen in other forms of literature. So because we have the beautiful poetry of Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, and we have the stories of Zora Neale Hurston. Now we begin to see Black characters in a way that not just makes them human, but allows them to have a range of emotion and feeling, and to explore experiences through the work of fiction. So Zora Neale Hurston is one major author from the Harlem Renaissance, and of course she's known for Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is one of her most famous literary works. And the story of Hurston is amazing because while she had some relative success during the time in which she was writing, she basically dies penniless, more or less. And if you are familiar with Alice Walker, many in the literary world kind of credit Walker with like giving life to the works that Hurston wrote. And In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, it talks about how Walker goes back to find Hurston's grave, and in some ways kind of unearths who she was as an amazing woman and a matriarch and leader for the Black women, that writers and authors that we see in later times in African American literature, and particularly in the Black arts movement.